Flames burn for a second day at the Balaswa landfill, adding to the hazardous air quality in the capital. The plumes of smoke hard for anyone to avoid, especially waste workers.
There's
a fire every year. It's not new. There is a risk to life and livelihood. Many slum dwellings caught fire, people left, but what do we do?
Picking through rubbish to earn a living. Their only option is to carry on and risk the dangerous smoke as firefighters continue to battle the blaze.
We are very scared. We inhale these gases which cause diseases. I feel pain while breathing, and there are many others like this.
Indians are suffering a heat wave which is adding to the risk of fires. March was the hottest month in more than a century. Prime Minister Narendra Modi warned state governments that temperatures are rising much earlier than normal, leading to wildfires and fires in buildings such as hospitals. He's urging the urgent implementation of safety checks. The landfill was supposed to close years ago. The decaying waste produces methane gas that feeds the fire. Instead of shutting the waste dump, the city adds 2,000 tons of new waste every day.
Labourers in New Delhi work through temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius to construct India's new parliament buildings. Like many street vendors and auto rickshaw drivers here, they make up some of the 75% of India's workforce who work outdoors.
We have to go outside to work. It's very hot. Even the water we carry becomes too hot to drink. We don't even have enough water.
A heat wave has gripped many parts of India for weeks. That's after the nation saw its hottest March since records began 122 years ago. The higher than usual temperatures have led to demand for electricity reaching an all-time high this week and power cuts in several states. Delhi's regional government has told people to expect power outages at metros and hospitals because of a shortage of coal at power plants. The Indian government has cancelled hundreds of passenger trains to rush coal to thermal power plants around the country. The intense heat has also affected wheat crops, with some agriculture experts predicting this year's yield will be 25% less. That could have international implications. India was planning to help fill the gap in global wheat supplies left by Russia and Ukraine.
We also know that 55 countries were dependent on the food coming from the Baltic region, and 55 is not a small number. So if you can't be standing along with another 55 looking for wheat supplies next year. So I think we have to be very watchful and careful.
Meteorologists say the severe weather is part of a reoccurring trend.
You notch the temperature up. So when you get these heat wave events, they're becoming more frequent, they're more intense, and when they happen, they last longer. So we're definitely seeing a shift in the trend to more intense heat waves happening in this part of the world.
The Indian Meteorological Department says heatwave conditions will continue in several regions in the next 5 days, but there's little respite expected afterwards, with May and June usually the hottest months of the year.
Lotiko and Herek Kurinyang are worried about their baby boy. He's 7 months old and sick, weak and hungry. There isn't enough food because of the drought. His mother can't get enough food to eat and can't produce enough milk for him. They lost another child in February. They say he starved.
He got sick and died. I don't know what to do about this other child. She might also die because she's hungry.
Millions of families across the Horn of Africa are hungry and desperate. They're facing the worst drought the region has seen in 40 years. In Kenya, more than 3.5 million people need immediate help. Aid agencies say nearly 800,000 of them are children. The animals too are dying as it gets hotter and drier. People out here tend to move around a lot, looking for food and water for themselves and their animals. Many areas are remote. The nearest hospital can be hours away. Some of the women here say they can leave very early in the morning and only get to the clinic late at night. Cases of malnutrition are rising. At this local health center, health workers are struggling to cope. They say when some of the children get here, they are severely malnourished.
Malnutrition has been here for so long. Myself, I can say it is a chronic malnutrition, but it has worsened because of the drought. For the last 2 years, we have not received rainfall.
Grace Gibe says many children are going to school hungry. She says this drought is the worst she has ever seen.
Some of them, they're just dying, and we have nothing to just feed them. And our animals are all die because we are just dependent for animals.
What little water is left in streams and rivers may soon run out. Desperate families stress the little that's left and can only hope the rains soon fall again.
The parade marked the 90th anniversary of the founding of North Korea's military, and it was meant to show off the power of its modern-day weaponry. On display were some of the newest weapons it has recently been testing, such as hypersonic missiles, and a more advanced, longer-range submarine-launched ballistic missile. After several years of attempted negotiations aimed at denuclearization, leader Kim Jong-un seems to have abandoned all such efforts at conciliation.
In the world today, where powers are fiercely clashing with other powers, national dignity, sovereignty, and true peace can only be guaranteed by strong self-defense to overcome any enemy.
North Korea's star of this show was what it says is its most powerful intercontinental ballistic missile to date, the Hwasong-17. It's the same type of weapon it says it launched at the end of March, the first fully fledged test of an ICBM since 2017. It seems North Korea has nothing to lose by putting on a big show of military force right now. US and South Korean forces have gone ahead with their joint spring exercises. South Korea has just chosen a conservative administration that's likely to take a much tougher stand with the North, and US President Joe Biden will soon be visiting Northeast Asia. President Biden will be attempting to bolster support from the United States allies, South Korea and Japan. But there's mounting speculation that North Korea might even be planning a return to underground nuclear weapon testing for the first time in 5 years.
The basic mission of our nuclear capability is to deter war, but our nuclear weapons are not just for the sole mission of deterrence. If any attempts are made to usurp our interests, we might have no choice but to call on those weapons.
Pyongyang seems as determined as ever to be accepted by the international community as a nuclear power to be reckoned with.
The once bustling commercial centre of Shanghai is quiet and empty, with most of the city's 25 million people forced to stay at home as part of the government's strict zero COVID-19 policy. In the capital, Beijing, authorities have completed 3 rounds of mass testing ahead of the Labor Day holiday. Many say they're tired of the restrictions, which they fear could soon become even tougher.
2 years ago, everyone had a very vigilant attitude towards epidemic prevention. But now, maybe because it's been too long, people want to go out and have fun.
You look at a city that used to be crowded and now is empty, and you can't help but wonder how these people managed to survive. I'm suppressing a lot of emotions.
The impact of the zero COVID policy is being felt economically too. China's manufacturing has dropped to its lowest level in more than 2 years. Retail sales are down and unemployment is at its highest since May 2020. Analysts say results for this quarter will be worse.
The dynamic zero strategy is not sustainable, and we can see many examples in Shanghai. And for a lot of the companies in digital industry, in manufacturing, they're under a lot of pressure to lay off more workers. But right now, China doesn't seem to have a new solution to this problem.
Experts warn the economic impact will extend beyond China, with consumers around the world told to expect more inflation and higher prices.
This factory on the outskirts of Shanghai normally produces around 300,000 bicycles every month. It counts US department store Walmart among its many international clients. But because of a strict coronavirus lockdown, it's been forced to close for 4 weeks. Confined to his home, manager Lei Ge worries about his 2,000 workers and his bottom line.
To be honest, it's very difficult for them. I would like to pay a little bit more, but you know, the loss for the company is also big. I don't know how am I going to survive after this, but I will try to survive after this.
Authorities in Shanghai say a new round of testing will decide whether neighborhoods can begin opening up. Most of the city's 25 million residents remain locked down. It sparked anger and protest in the commercial center. Here, people are heard banging pots and pans from their apartment windows. One woman screams, "Give me back my freedom." Still, Chinese leaders insist on maintaining a zero COVID-19 policy.
They are trying to contain the public discontent, but we are still working with a Leninist system, which means that it is the target that has been set by the top leadership, which is of paramount importance for cadres responsible for any of those specific policies. Public discontent comes much lower in the list of priorities for them to meet.
There have been complaints of food shortages, the separation of families, and the killing of pets by health workers. But analysts say any political blame is likely to fall on low-level officials, not President Xi Jinping or top Beijing ministers. In the capital, authorities are doing all they can to prevent a citywide lockdown. People have stocked up on supplies, bracing for the results of 3 rounds of mass testing conducted this week. More than 100 infections have been recorded, resulting in the closure of some schools, entertainment venues, and tourist sites. Dozens of neighborhoods have been barricaded. The heavy-handed measures resemble those imposed during the early days of the pandemic. More than 2 years on, many are questioning whether the cure is worse than the disease itself.
It had been predicted by some, feared by many more. But European leaders see Russia's move to halt gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria because they won't pay in rubles as aggressive.
It comes as no surprise that the Kremlin uses fossil fuels to try to blackmail us. This is something the European Commission has been preparing for in close coordination and solidarity with member states and international partners. Our response will be immediate, united and coordinated.
Moscow says countries can still pay for gas imports in euros or dollars, but only if they open Russian bank accounts, which then convert the currency and make the final payment. It's thought some countries have already done so. But Bulgaria, which gets the vast majority of its gas supplies from Gazprom, is not one of them.
We will not succumb to such a racket. Bulgaria is reviewing all agreements with Gazprom, including the agreement on gas transit through Bulgaria, because one-sided blackmail is not acceptable.
The Polish president has promised to take legal action, but the Prime Minister is insisting there's no immediate threat, saying storage facilities are 3/4 full, higher than in most of Europe.
As I've emphasised many times, Poland had previously prepared to diversify supplies and obtain gas from various sources. Even before the Baltic gas pipeline is launched, we'll be able to protect our economy, to protect Polish households from such a dramatic step by Russia.
Some Warsaw residents, if not all, seem reassured. This man says shutting down gas supplies might end up harming Russia. He says his country has reserves. While this woman wonders how much Poles like her will have to pay for developments linked to the Ukraine war, saying things are already incredibly expensive. The EU's biggest economy, Germany, has been the most reluctant to end gas imports from Russia, but on Wednesday it said it was speeding up efforts to find alternatives, including liquefied natural gas.
I can say that our Russian gas dependency, which was at 55% before the war and dropped to 40% a few weeks ago, is now at 35%.
So for now, the common message is there's no need to panic. But it's hard to say how Russia's move will play into the existing energy price crisis across Europe. Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says Ukraine was pushed to clash with Russia, and Moscow's reaction was just and fair. Speaking to politicians in St. Petersburg, he warned that any country that interferes in Ukraine will face consequences.
If anyone would want to interfere with what's happening in Ukraine now from the outside, they have to know Russia's response will be swift and fast. We have all sorts of tools that the West cannot obtain, and we will not boast of our weapons, but we will use them if need be, and I want everyone to know that.
Dostabari has this update from Moscow.
The Russian president is not really passing up this opportunity to reiterate the reasons that he felt it was necessary for him to make the decision to send the Russian troops into Ukraine in what he calls a special military operation that is now in its 63rd day. Vladimir Putin, as we just heard, had a very strong and stern warning for those countries that are assisting Ukraine in the fight against the Russian troops. He said that they're basically fair game for the Russians, and that this is a fight between Russia and Ukraine, and that the third countries that are getting involved really have no right to do so, and that he feels that he will be forced to make a decision as to whether or not to use all the tools that are at his disposal to ensure a victory for the Russian military. Now, Vladimir Putin was also speaking quite a bit about the objectives that he set out for his legislative officials about ensuring that Russia's economy stays intact, and he said that the attempts that have been made by the Western powers to try to cripple Russia's economy through severe sanctions have failed, and that Russia is standing still and they are not going to allow its economy to crumble. He also urged the officials that he was speaking to, he said they have to work on anti-crisis measures, and also they have to strengthen the country's sovereignty. There's a lot of emphasis on trying to basically ensure that Russia's economy stays strong and that the ruble doesn't plummet like it did a few weeks ago.
To what's happening on the battlefield, and Mariupol city officials say Russia continues to strike the last remaining Ukrainian army positions there, with 35 aerial hits since Monday. Thousands of Ukrainian fighters and civilians are in underground tunnels and chambers below the AZOVSTAL steel plant. Last week, Vladimir Putin ordered troops not to storm the plant, but blockade it. Russia agreed in principle to allow the UN and the Red Cross to help evacuate civilians from the steel plant in Mariupol after Putin's meeting with the UN Secretary-General on Tuesday.
In the Mariupol direction, the enemy is exerting massive fire and blocking our units in the area of the AZOVSTAL plant. In the city, occupiers continue to carry out filtration measures against the civilian population.
And there have been protests in Kyiv demanding safe humanitarian corridors out of the AZOVSTAL steel plant. Mothers and wives of soldiers fighting in Mariupol attended the demonstrations. Agreements between Ukraine and Russia to allow safe passage of fighters and civilians have failed so far. Ukrainian forces are also confronting the Russian military in the east. Fierce fighting has been reported in Mykolaiv and Kherson in the southeast. Russian forces also shelled the town of Lyman. In southern Ukraine, the Russian military's fired tear gas and stun grenades at protesters in the city of Kherson. People are rallying against what they're calling a sham referendum. Ukraine says Russia is planning to hold a staged vote in the Kherson region to try and show popular support for the creation of a Russian-backed republic. Kherson is occupied by Russian troops, and residents have been protesting against their presence for weeks.
It's a world away from the war in neighbouring Ukraine. After everything these refugees have been through, Moldova feels safe.
It was so tense in Odessa, now it's even worse. Our town's being heavily bombed, and the number of casualties is going up. We're just trying to get used to living here now. My 7-year-old daughter's traumatized. At least we can sleep now and not be afraid.
But there are fears the war is widening and that Russia has its sights set on this former Soviet republic. This week, a string of mysterious attacks and explosions destroyed infrastructure in Transnistria, a pro-Russian separatist region of Moldova. It claimed independence in the early 1990s following a brief war with Moldovan troops, but it isn't recognized internationally. It has its own government, currency and leadership, and makes no secret of wanting to join Russia. Western intelligence chiefs, along with Ukrainian and Moldovan officials, believe Russia staged the attacks to justify mobilizing around 1,500 or so Russian troops permanently based in Transnistria, along with several thousand Transnistrian conscripts. It follows recent comments from a Russian commander saying that the Kremlin's latest strategy was to try and link Russian troops in the east and south of Ukraine with Russian forces in Transnistria. The comments have caused alarm in Moldova. It only has 6,500 under-equipped soldiers, making it vulnerable to a swift Russian invasion. And like Ukraine, Moldova isn't a member of the EU or NATO. The country's former defense chief, Brigadier General Vitaly Marinutsa, believes it's time to abandon neutrality enshrined in its constitution.
You have to be on the right or on the left, especially when you are here in this part of the world. I am one of the promoters of joining NATO, of not being neutral, and having allies which are really strong military, economically, politically. And I think for us it's the best. But I'm in a minority here in the country.
There are also concerns the Kremlin could attempt to sow division between the country's Russian and Moldovan-speaking communities. And there's another lever Russia could pull: energy supplies.
We are absolutely dependent on Russian gas, 100%, and 70% of our electricity is generated using that gas. Most of it's produced in Transnistria. We are totally dependent on Russia. If supplies were to stop suddenly, our economy would collapse, and the consequences would be extremely serious.
For now, Ukrainian forces have repelled a Russian landing in the port city of Odessa, blocking access routes to Moldova from the Black Sea. Should the tide of war change, there are fears the conflict will rapidly spread beyond Ukraine.
Natalia has worked at this bread factory in the town of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine for 13 years. Russian forces are slowly getting closer. They are first firing artillery shells and rockets, then moving in on nearby villages. The closer they get, the more tempted the mother of two is to leave.
I'm very worried for myself, for my family, for the children, for my job. It's frightening going to and from work because I hear the explosions in the distance. I love my job and have many friends. I don't want to leave them.
The bread factory is the largest and oldest business in town, employing around 200 people. They supply bread to many surrounding villages, but the amount of customers is shrinking as they flee the slow Russian army advance. Volunteer delivery driver ANDREI is a brave man. After loading up his van with freshly baked loaves, he heads out of town towards the front line. We follow him along isolated, empty country roads to a village near the Russian army-controlled town of Horlivka. The village shopkeeper and few people still living here have been waiting for his delivery for 3 days.
Over there, closer to Toretsk, the whole field has been shelled so heavily, it looks like they were digging it. Go have a look. But it's so loud there, and there's still people living there. I don't feel particularly afraid. People need bread. They have to eat. If they shell me, so be it. This is war.
The village sits in between the advancing Russian army and Ukrainian military defense dug in across the fields. The trains stopped coming here in 2014 when pro-Russian separatists seized control of the next city down the tracks.
It's terrifying. There are explosions constantly. Getting food to us is dangerous and there's never enough. We feel surrounded because they shoot from this side and that side. All of those who are left here are old. There are no medicines available, no buses, no transport here.
We drive to Toretsk, swerving between piles of soil heaped on the road to try and slow down any Russian army advance. In a nearby village, we find homes destroyed. The Ukrainian army tell us that this village has been hit by Russian artillery a number of times in the last week. They say at least one civilian has been killed in these strikes. The most recent strike was this morning, a number of civilians injured. The soldiers here tell us that the Russian positions are around 7 kilometers from here. Ukrainian soldiers say Russian forces are trying to destroy a radio antenna, but so far have only succeeded in destroying lives.
a show of force against Sri Lanka's President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his administration. Services were disrupted as thousands of workers joined a one-day strike demanding the government's resignation.
We are telling the government very clearly they should heed to the message of the working class, or else it won't just be one day. We will work towards longer stoppages and paralyse the country if we have to chase Gotabaya Rajapaksa.
Teachers, dentists, postal workers, railway staff and bankers were among the many thousands of people who stayed away from work to join colleagues in marches like this one in Colombo. They say they will lend their full support to the protest movement against a government they say is inefficient and corrupt and has only looked after its own needs, not the people's.
Our system was political system, administrative system. They are very ineffective system. We want to change that into an effective one.
Strikers marched to the president's office, where anti-government protests entered their 20th consecutive day on Thursday. Similar marches and protests were held in each district, bringing striking workers. Here outside the main government hospital in Chilau in northwest Sri Lanka, nurses carried a coffin, symbolizing what they say is the final journey of the present government. Train stations were deserted, even the main railway station in Colombo, the nerve center for commuters. And bus stops were crowded, with people hopeful they can board the few buses on the roads. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his government are fighting major battles on the economic and political fronts. The government has no money to pay for food, medicine, fuel and other essential imports after its foreign reserves fell to alarming levels. The government is talking to the IMF, World Bank and friendly countries to raise emergency funds. But newly appointed Finance Minister Ali Sabri has admitted things will get hard before they get better.
Union leaders say today's work stoppage is just a token of what they can do. They warn that if the government does not heed calls to leave, they will launch much worse.
She's the last witness of a massacre that killed hundreds of indigenous peoples in Argentina almost 100 years ago. Rosa Grillo is a member of the Quom indigenous community. She was around 7 years old when her father was murdered during a protest. Now she's over 100 years old and says she still remembers the day her community was attacked.
I passed out and woke up when I was given water. I got home and looked up and saw a plane flying overhead. There were children on the ground. This is the pain I have carried forever. I was not able to speak.
Rosa lives in the northern province of Chaco and is part of a truth trial that seeks to investigate the crimes committed against her community.
People here continue to remember the massacre that happened in this place when hundreds of members of indigenous communities were killed by security forces and ranchers. They were protesting and demanding an improvement of the semi-slavery conditions they lived in. They were killed, their bodies dismembered, buried all around this area. Until recently, anthropologists have been digging in this place, trying to find proof of what's been Argentina's systematic persecution of indigenous people.
Now, for the first time, a trial seeks to establish the facts of the Napalpí massacre. Even though the perpetrators are long dead, this is an opportunity to begin a long-sought reparation process for the killings, but also decades of discrimination against indigenous groups in the country. Federico Carniel says the trial is important so that abuse against minority groups never happens again.
All of this is based on the legal parameters of the time. Argentina had already signed international agreements that allow us to set in a panel trial that crimes against humanity were committed and do not prescribe.
Mariana Giordano has been investigating the massacre for years. She says the killings in Napalpí were not isolated. Indigenous groups were for many years a source of cheap labor in the country, and Giordano says violence against them was justified as necessary by the ruling class.
Ethnic groups have been discriminated against, persecuted, and the massacre shows that for a very long time the state tried to force indigenous groups to blend with the rest of the population. They were part of a structure that had them as cheap labor in the fields.
only about 1 million of Argentina's 45 million inhabitants are descendants of the original 39 indigenous groups. Most of them are among the poorest in the country. Many see the trial as a unique opportunity to begin a long-awaited process of acknowledgement and reparation.